This is Real Talk, the customer insights show with Jenn Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen on all major podcast channels. Join Jenn and her guests for a weekly discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Real Talk is presented to you by VoxPopMe, the leader in video research and ranked number 1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm your host, Jenn Vogel, and today we're talking about positioning. Why is it so hard? How can we get it right? And how do we know when we're done with it? To discuss that topic, I am so excited to be joined by April Dunford, founder of Ambient Strategy, author of Obviously Awesome, How to Nail Product Positioning so Customers Will Get It, Buy It, and Love It. Welcome to the show, April.
Hey, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to have this chat. There's certain people that, I've read their books or, seen their content that I'm just a huge fan of. And you are one of them. I love your book. I've read it twice, once on audio and once on written paper, like the old fashioned way. But anyways, if I fangirl a little bit, then please don't mind me.
That's awesome. I'm surprised actually at how many people do audio and the book. I've heard that from a number of people, and I think that's interesting book buyer behavior.
Yeah, totally. We should dig into that maybe in another show.
Yeah.
So to kick us off, let's get right into talking about product positioning. Why is it so hard, and where do you see companies struggle?
Yeah, it's funny. The funny thing about positioning is that it's not a new concept. It's been around since the early 80s. There was this book written by these guys, Rees and Trout. It's called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. And that's been around since pre-internet. So you think we'd be really good at this and we'd have it all figured out by now. But I think positioning is really, really misunderstood. Most folks, I think, confuse positioning with things we want to do with positioning once we have it. So people will say, oh, I know what positioning is. It's just like messaging, or we're writing a tagline. Or my personal pet peeve is when people talk about brand positioning, which really bugs me because I think there's branding and there's positioning, and those two things are actually totally separate. So I think about positioning as positioning defines how your product is the best in the world at delivering some value that a well-defined set of customers cares a lot about. That's a mouthful, but maybe a simpler way of thinking about it is it's like context setting for products. Context is important because that's how we make sense of things, particularly new things that we haven't seen before. But to answer your question, like, why is it so hard? I think for most companies, a lot of companies fall into the trap of just kind of default positioning. Like there's this idea like, hey, we're database people, we're building a database. What else could it be? Like, this isn't hard. We'll just position this as a database. It literally couldn't be anything else. But what I've learned is that often we get a product out in the market, we make changes to it, the market itself changes, and eventually we get to this point where, we think of it as one thing, but a new customer coming at it fresh looks at it and says, I don't know if it's really that thing or not. And this confusion or this gap between how we think about the product versus how the customer thinks about the product actually results in all of this confusion. And so I think the reason it's hard is because we tend to not position deliberately.
Oh my gosh, so much good stuff in there. I think that like what you're describing about that context setting, and it's not just this is a database. This is what it is in the context of how your customer is going to use it or think about it, and that whole idea of bridging the gap between how we think about our product and how our customers think about our product is right. Like really where the hardest part is. And we were just talking about this a couple of weeks ago on the show about, the famous, Simon Sinek, like, you need to understand your why, and really why that's maybe not the right approach, that, understanding your why as a company or a product doesn't actually bring the customer into.
Like, I don't like it. Like, some of this stuff goes around, and I think intellectually it's interesting, right? And I think, there are some folks that write books and do speeches, like, and I think Simon Sinek sort of falls into this. And I think they're good for getting us to think a different way about something, but they're not necessarily meant to be taken super literally. Because, like, I've seen companies come to me and they're like, we did this whole exercise about our why, and now we don't know what to do with it. And I'm like, you don't do anything with it, man. like, I don't know what to do with it. But like,
Check the box and move on.
Even if I use the examples that Simon Sinek uses in that book, like, we don't buy Apple because of their products, we buy because of their why. And I said, great, what's Apple's why? No one knows.
No.
It's like, well, I guess that's not why we're buying it then. But
right.
But I don't think this stuff is meant to be taken that literally.
I totally agree. Yeah.
But the folks like us that are in the trenches actually trying to do stuff, like, sometimes we read these books, or I do anyways, or I read these books and I'm like, come on, man, what am I supposed to do with this?
Right. Well, it's so true. And I mean, the Apple example is a great one, that, it's not the why that I understand. It's the context that they've put their products in for me. They're not telling me, I have no idea how many pixels the camera on my phone has.
Right.
I could tell you some of the other competitors, because that's how they position. They tell you what the product is, but Apple is selling something, a sort of experience or a lifestyle or something that I feel like I want, and I want to be a part of. I don't actually know all that much about the product, nor do I think the product itself is the best.
Plus, there's this whole sort of ecosystem. Like, once you're in, it's very difficult to get out. So they just need to sell you the first one, and then after that, you're not going anywhere.
That's right. Yes, I just need more things that integrate with the first thing I got, and
it's actually really hard. It's really hard to get out. I'm not in the Apple ecosystem. Like, I actually just got rid of my last Apple thing, which was, I used to use a MacBook Air, and I just got rid of that and replaced it with PC. But it's mainly because, like, I was a smartphone user before the iPhone. And so when the iPhone came out, it was a pretty crappy smartphone. And so it wasn't until the iPhone 3 or 4 where you could actually even roam with your phone in Europe. And I was like, I'm not giving up my perfectly good phone that roams in Europe and everything else for this thing that doesn't even work in half the places I go. And by the time they caught up, the phones were all the same. And so, I just didn't go. Now I can't go because I'm too locked into the Android thing. Like, it's the same reason that the Apple people can't leave.
Right.
Like, it's too hard to make the switch from one to the other.
It is hard to make the switch. There are other products that it's a bit easier, but certainly with
forget it.
Yeah, you get trapped. It's like the mafia or something. Well, and so so we've talked about, like, positioning is not just what the product is, right? You've got to understand the context and how your customers think about it. So how does what's the role of understanding customers? What tips can you offer to kind of get to them and understand their context or how they think about your product to help with that positioning?
Right. So there's a few things that I think that are really critical to understand if we're thinking about positioning and we want to think about what should we know about our customers. So the first one is, we need to understand how a customer makes a purchase decision. And this is, I don't work much in consumer products. I work mainly with B2B companies. And so in B2B, this is often not a very straightforward process at all. Like, typically when we sell something into a company, there are many people involved in making that decision. And so the data tells us it's between 5 and 8 people that are involved in making a decision to buy a particular piece of software for a business. So we need to understand, we need to understand who the champion is for that deal, meaning the person that's doing the bulk of the work to evaluate the product and how it's going to evaluate the product, figure out who's going to be on a short list, figure out how we're going to make a choice. But we also need to understand a little bit about who else does the champion need to get on board to make this deal happen. So sometimes there are end users you have to worry about. Sometimes there's an IT group or security or legal. Sometimes they're not the economic buyer. There's a person above them that actually writes the check. So we need to understand how that person needs to convince them. So that's a lot of understanding, like what is the purchase process. So we need to understand that. This other bits that we need to understand is that we obviously need to understand the pain and the problem that the customer is wrestling with. But even more importantly in positioning, we need to understand the customer's perspective on what alternate solutions there are. And so again, if I think of a typical B2B sale, typically if they have a problem, they're already solving it some way. And often that way is terrible. So they're doing it with a spreadsheet, they're doing it with interns, they're doing pen and paper, they're solving things manually. Maybe they're using their old, terrible ERP system that was never designed to do this particular task, and they're doing it that way. I need to understand that. Like, what is this status quo in the account? And then I also need to understand that when the customer wakes up and says, you know what, we can't keep doing it that way. We've got to do something else. I need to understand what that trigger is. Like, what is it that, does something break? Do they have an accident? Does this person get a new boss? Does somebody come in and say, oh my gosh, we're doing it this way? No, we shouldn't do it that way. Like, what happens to trigger a purchase process? And then when they do get into a purchase process, how do they make a short list? Like in B2B, we don't just buy the first thing we come across and say, ooh, shiny red one, let's get one of those. I got to justify this to my boss. I got to justify it to end users, to NT, to IT. I don't even know who else. And so I can't just buy the first thing I come across. I need to make a short list. I need to explain to my boss how I made a short list. So how do your customers do that? So we need to understand that. We need to understand who lands on the short list. And then, of course, we need to understand, why do they pick us and why not the other ones?
I mean, you make it sound so easy.
Yeah. It's easier to talk about than it is to actually do it.
It really is. And, one of the things I find certainly about like understanding the pain, and you said it perfectly, like what is the trigger for solving that pain in a different way? Like, how painful is that pain?
Right.
Because I find oftentimes you can, a customer will say like, yes, absolutely, that is a pain that I'm experiencing, or the solution I have for solving that is not sufficient. But let's rank that. Oh, there's my dog. Welcome to the show. Let's rank that on a scale of all the pains you experience.
Right.
At any given time, I, as a customer, as a buyer of software, I'm experiencing more than one pain.
Totally.
So I might say, yes, that pain that you're talking to me about, totally. I totally experienced that. It's not my biggest pain, right?
I think people go about this in a weird way. Like a lot of companies, and maybe even I did this when I was junior. Like, we have this product, and then we would get together in a room and we'd say, what's the pain that this solves? And I think that's a terrible way to go about it. Or even worse, we would say, we sell to these kinds of customers. What kind of pain do they have? Mm-hmm. And we're this crummy little startup. We do like 3 tiny little things. Like, customers have all kinds of pain, and and the vast majority of pain they have, we don't solve. And so, I changed my thinking about this a lot as I moved along in my career. And in particular, I spent a lot of time reading Clayton Christensen and Jobs to Be Done. And in Clayton Christensen's Jobs to Be Done stuff, there's this story about the milkshake, this famous milkshake story. The product managers all know this one, which is, there's this company, they're a fast food restaurant, and they're selling milkshakes, and they want to make a better milkshake. And so they're trying to figure out what can they do to make this milkshake better. And they do this, this research, and they find out they sell a lot of milkshakes in the morning. and they sell them in the drive-through. Like, what's up with that? And then they find out, well, oh, actually, people got a long commute and they're bored and hungry. And so the milkshake is perfect because it fits in the cup holder, and unlike a breakfast sandwich, it doesn't dribble all over my suit. And but it's also kind of thick and it lasts a long time, and it's sort of boredom relief on a long drive and blah blah blah. And so what they did to improve the product was they said, oh, okay, the jobs I'm trying to do, or the pain they have is boredom, and I need something that I can eat in the car without making a mess of myself. But when I thought about that story from a positioning perspective, what I thought was really interesting out of that observation was the competitive comparable. So instead of going to the customer and say, what pain do you have? I could have just went to the customer and said, well, look, if you didn't buy the milkshake, what would you buy? And they would say, oh, I'd buy a breakfast sandwich or a donut or whatever. And what they're not saying is, I would have bought a Coke or a Sprite or something. And so if I knew what you were comparing me to, I could infer a lot about the problem. And I could infer the positioning, maybe I shouldn't be positioning this thing as a milkshake. Maybe I should be positioning it as a breakfast smoothie or something, right?
Yes.
So in B2B, I think the more we understand about what customers are comparing us to, the more we can get our arms around, how we're going to win. Like, well, how would I be better than a breakfast sandwich? Well, in the drive-through, that's kind of obvious. Right? How would I be better than a donut? And if I understand the situation of the customer and who they're comparing me to, I could maybe understand what have I got that the alternative doesn't have.
Well, especially when you're thinking about products, whether it's B2B or B2C, that are new or innovative or,
totally.
Don't have a direct competition, understanding what you're replacing is really helpful. And to your point, I mean, I've done that like pain analysis of like, what pain are our customers experiencing? And then presenting that to people and people going, well, I'm like, this is the number one pain. They go, well, but we can't solve that pain. Like, that's not the one I'm interested in hearing about. I'm like, well, this is it.
This drives me crazy on the sales side of the house, because what I see happening in sales is I see a lot of sales reps get trained to do that. So what they're trained to do is to go in and have and the starting point of a sales conversation is, let's have a conversation about your pain. And I think that's a waste of time a lot of the time, because again, customers got all kinds of pain. And especially if we're a startup, we solve one little thing. So why don't we just assume they have that pain, or why don't we just qualify them on that one and then be done with it? And instead what we have is this thing, and it's like sales therapy, right? I'm going to come in and say, tell me your problems, all your problems. We're going to spend 20 minutes talking about that. And then why? I have no idea why, because I'm going to pitch you the same thing at the end of that anyway. And it only solves one of those things. So I might as well go in and say, you know what? We work with a lot of companies like you, and what we see is they're wrestling with this. Is that true for your organization? Because if it's not, maybe we don't need to talk today.
Right. Yes, it's so true. I mean, we're all guilty of that, right?
We think we're selling professional services here, where we can solve anything with, custom stuff, but we're not. We get this crummy little SaaS thing. It only does 3 things, man.
Right. This is it. This is what you get.
That's all you get. Like, if you either want it or you don't, man.
I like that sales approach. I think we might need to rethink our.
Not joking. A lot of the companies that I work with, I start out with this idea, and it's kind of hard to get the sales reps out of that, because they've been trained to do that. Like, I need to do discovery first, and this discovery is uncovering the pains, and that makes a lot of sense if we're selling professional services. It makes a lot of sense if we're IBM, and I could pretty much solve any pain you have because I have a super broad portfolio. But when we're in startups doing something that's really narrow, I think that's just a waste of time. And I think that's just bad sales practices, to be honest.
That's some really good advice. We might take that away.
Calling up here going, wait, that's not good. She should shut up.
No, I love it. Let's challenge the traditional way of doing things, right? And do something a little different.
Well, I said this at a conference once.
Yeah.
And, it was a bunch of early stage startup founders, and there was a mix of marketing and salespeople too. And, and I was talking about how I think people should build a sales pitch for, SaaS startup. And some guy at the back put up his hand and said, well, hang on, like, don't we have to do this thing at the beginning and ask them all about their pain and all this stuff? And I'm like, but it doesn't matter what they say. We still only solve this one thing. Like, it's performative. Like, why are we doing that? And you can see the whole room kind of going, never really thought about that before. People came up and asked me about that afterwards. Like, I never actually thought about why are we asking all these questions, because we end up rolling into the same pitch regardless of what they say.
Yeah. So it's really, the key is to understand the context in which they're going to use you, and sell on that platform.
Yeah, like I really think when we're doing positioning work, again, the anchor is, what do I got to position against? Like, so if I didn't exist, what would a customer be doing? That's what I really need to understand. And what they'd be doing is they'd be using whatever their status quo thing is, spreadsheet, interns, manual process, or they would start a sales process and they'd make a short list. So really, for positioning, what I really need to understand is who's my status quo, who ends up on a short list, and that's all I got to position against. Because there might be other alternatives for doing things, but these are the only things in my customer's consideration set. Then all I've got to do is position against that. Mm-hmm. So I think we can do good positioning by saying, okay, stake in the ground. This is what I got to beat in order to win a deal. And then I can sit down and say, well, what have I got that they don't have? Like, and I've got capability, and these are features, right? Capabilities of the company, features. I can fill up whiteboards with this, right? All kinds of stuff. And then what I can do is go down that list of capabilities and translate this to value. Like, why is that? It's like your megapixels on the camera thing. It's like, I got 29 megapixel camera. So what? So what for my business? What, why does anybody care about that? And I can translate that to value. Now, typically when we do this for a B2B SaaS company, we go down that list, we go to translate to value, and we don't get 59 points of value. We get 2 or 3 value buckets or value themes. And then once I get that, then I can say, look, we're the only company on the planet that can do this for your business. Here's how we do it. We can do this for your business. Here's how we do it. We can do this for your business. Here's how we do it. And then once I've got that, then I can actually lean back and say, okay, like, this is my differentiated value. This is the value that I can deliver that no other solution in the market can deliver. But not everybody cares the same about that. So what are the characteristics of a target account that make them really care a lot about the value that only I can deliver? And that's where the magic happens. I got this value that we're the only people that can deliver. And I got these kind of customers that really, really care a lot about that. That's where the magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what are some of the tactics that you would suggest to get started with discovering that? Like, how do you know what those alternatives are that people are using and what that profile is of that buyer that cares about that?
Yeah. So if you're a product that hasn't launched yet, this is very hard. You don't know. And so if you're a product that hasn't launched yet, if you've done good customer discovery research, you might have some guesses at this, but that's all they are, is guesses. And so I would call this, at this point, I would call this a positioning thesis, right? So I have a thesis, and my thesis says, I think we compete against these folks. We're different in this way. This is the value only we can deliver. These are the kind of customers that are going to love it. Therefore, this is the market we're going to win. But you don't know, like customers are weird, products are weird, markets are weird. You go to launch, and in my experience, you don't get it all right. But after you've got a first wave of customers, you start seeing the patterns. And so you start seeing, if it's these kinds of customers love what we do and they love it for this reason, right? These customers, and here's who they compare us to and whatever. And eventually you get to a point where you're like, okay, now I'm ready to really tighten the positioning up because I know. If it's B2B and you have a sales team, you know a lot about who customers compare you to, because that is a natural part of your sales process, right? The sales rep will be like, well, what are you using now to solve the problem? And who else is on the short list? And who are we competing with? So if we have a sales team, we actually know quite a bit about that. If it's a zero-touch sales model, then we know nothing. And we're going to have to go and get that by actually going and doing customer research to find out what is the status quo in these accounts that we're winning. In these accounts that we're winning, did they look at something else? And if so, what was it? Why did we win? Why did they pick us? All that stuff. If we're lucky enough and if we're B2B and there's salespeople talking, then we know a lot about that already.
Yeah, that's true. But even in B2B, if you've got sort of a product-led growth model where it's fully DIY or self-serve,
well, most product-led growth has sales somewhere in the mix. That's the thing. Like,
yes,
most product-led growth has some kind of a sales motion. And at that point, we can figure it out.
Yeah.
What we don't know is what gets them through the door for the initial trial or the initial free thing that you're doing. That we're going to have to go research that, if that's super important and if we're gated there, like if we're having a problem there. If what we're really having a problem with is the conversion from the trial or the free thing to paid, again, if we've sold enough deals, we should start seeing the patterns in what works and what doesn't in the stuff we've already got. If we haven't seen the patterns, then we just haven't sold enough yet.
Right. You just need more data, more customers, and those patterns will start to emerge.
This is it. After a while, you see it.
Yeah. And so once we're kind of, whether we're at that early stage where we have the positioning thesis, I love that. I love the idea of just like positioning is kind of ever evolving anyways. But let's say your early stage positioning thesis, or you're, maybe a little further down the line, how do you start to communicate that positioning in a meaningful way?
Yeah. So I think there's lots of ways to make a positioning real for a company. So in the clients that I work with, we'll work through as a cross-functional team effort. We'll figure out what the positioning is. And usually what we do to test the positioning is, and again, because I'm working with B2B companies and there's typically a sales team, what we'll do is we'll take the positioning and we'll translate that into a sales narrative or a sales pitch. And then we can use that sales pitch to test positioning. I think that's the best way to test it. It's way better than trying to turn it into messaging and put it on a web page and A/B test that, because now I'm testing messaging and page layout and is the traffic I'm driving there good traffic or bad traffic and a whole bunch of other things. But if I've got a sales team, what I can do is I can build a sales pitch deck that reflects the positioning. I can get qualified prospects in the door, and then I can test and see what's going on. And you get a lot of signal. Like I can see if the customer is getting confused or getting excited, or, we're just losing them at some point. So that's usually how we test positioning. Once we have that tested and we validated it that, this works with a customer, then we can move on to, all right, I've got this positioning, I've got this sales narrative. How do we translate that into messaging and everything else? Typically what we've got is, when we're building a good sales pitch that communicates the positioning, that sales pitch is typically communicating our point of view on the market. And our point of view on the market, usually there's a couple of things that you need to believe as a customer in order to be aligned with my point of view. And so is often marketing's job to build content and other things that help us communicate that point of view and help get customers to understand this 2 or 3 key things that they need to understand why we're a good fit for them. So I'll give you an example of this. So company that I did some work with way back when, and I love them, called Level Jump. And what they do is sales enablement software. So it's software. If you've got a new rep onboarded, we're going to onboard the new rep so that they get to making quota really fast. Or let's say we have a change in the product and we need to train sales reps about this change so that they can sell more. That's what these folks do. Now, that's a really crowded market, and there are lots of other solutions in that space. But you can basically take the solutions in that space and divide them up into a couple of buckets. Like some of them are just content management systems. Like it's a good way to have a repository of trusted information that the reps can come and pull from. The other solutions in this space are more like an LMS, like a full-on learning management system. Set up a course, people get, trained on it, you get certified, whatever. Now, if you look at Level Jump, they've only got, they've got a lot of differentiated things, but they have a big one, which is they're the only one that's built on top of Salesforce. So their big differentiated value is you run this training and you can measure how effective the onboarding is with sales metrics. Like, so we did the training. Did the people get to first deal faster? Did they get to quota faster? None of the other ones can do that because they don't actually integrate with your sales data. So if I go to do that pitch, so here's the positioning. Who do I compete with? I got CMSs and LMSs. What's my differentiating feature? My differentiating feature is I built on Salesforce. What's the value of that? I basically can measure the results of my sales enablement. So we are sales enablement that drives results, sales results. Who cares a lot about that? Well, if you're hiring a lot of sales reps, you care. If you don't have much turnover on the sales team, maybe you don't care that much. And, so I'm hiring a lot of sales reps, I'm expanding. Maybe I have a lot of turnover in my sales team. So that's the positioning. Now we say, well, how are we going to communicate that? Well, first we've got the sales pitch, right? And the sales pitch, the thing that I have to get across in the sales pitch is this idea that it matters a lot to be able to measure the results. That's it. And so my pitch is, instead of doing a product walkthrough where it's like, here's how we log in, here's how we set up, training, here's how we distribute the training. Their sales pitch is sort of like this. They come in and they say, look, like I'm selling to the head of sales enablement, right? I come in and I say, hey, look, sales enablement is really important, right? It's really important. Why? It's important because every day your rep's not making quota costs you a lot of money. How much money? A lot. Here's a bunch of research that I did that shows it's like millions of dollars. You're wasting millions of dollars on sales enablement that doesn't drive sales results. Now look at all the other solutions out there. You can do it this way, you can do it that way. You know what none of these things do? None of them actually let you drive results. So wouldn't it be good to have sales enablement that we could track with sales metrics? Now, if you say yes to that, I got you. Because I'm the only one that does that. And I haven't even pitched you my product yet. I just pitched you my point of view on the market. So first we need to understand that story. Then when we go over the marketing side of the house, we're like, okay, well, what do I have to get a customer's head around in order to sell this thing? I got to get their head around this idea that sales enablement is a thing that we should be measuring with sales results. And so maybe I'm, doing research on that. Maybe I'm figuring out for my own customers how, what is the difference between if a rep is poorly onboarded versus onboarded very well, how much money am I saving or losing because of that? So, if you look at their marketing materials and the way they communicate that in their messaging, their homepage is all about sales enablement that drives results. Here's the metrics we can move, right? Like an 80% improvement in time to first deal and a 50% improvement in time it makes your reps to make quota and things like that. And what is the dollar value of that? We can talk about that. So they're doing a lot of stuff on that. The other thing they're doing is a lot of content that sort of explains, the whole market. Like, what is the difference between a CMS and an LMS versus something that's really sales onboarding or enablement? Because customers don't really understand that. And you need to understand that in order to pick them.
Mm, mm. This is so interesting. And I love that story. I love, how they really kind of tapped into the one thing, right? The differentiator, and that's
It's
all they need.
differentiated value, right? The nut of
Right.
your positioning is what's the value you can deliver that no one else can. If you can figure that out, and you can figure out who really cares a lot about that, magic. That's where the magic happens.
Yeah. The other thing I think is really interesting about what you said is how you really the positioning is tested with sales and not necessarily on a website or through advertising or,
Yeah.
I think that
But many
from
people
my
are lucky we can get away with that. If we don't have salespeople, then then we got no other
right,
choice. Then we got to test it in other ways. But
right,
I would still, and I have worked with companies that have done this, that that even though they don't have salespeople, they're actually testing the positioning live with customers. Like they basically
right.
fake it that they have a sales that they have a sales team temporarily, right? And so they force qualified customers instead of to self-serve to come through this sales detour so they can see whether or not the pitch works.
Yeah, I love that. That's so interesting. And I think, it's easy to test on a website because you have like numbers and data. Like, what's your definition of success when you're judging it by sales conversations? Is it like, some sort of gut feel like, hey, this feels like it's working? Or
Well,
is it
so
more
if you have experienced salespeople and you know when a pitch is going good and a pitch is going bad, but a lot of what we're doing when we test this pitch is we're looking for a bunch of specific things. So one is the customer understanding it as they go along? So weak positioning, often what we'll see in a sales pitch is the rep's doing a great job pitching it. We get 3 or 4 slides in and then the customer's like, I don't get it, man. Like back up and go to the beginning. And I'm like, what is it again? And then they're like, back up and do it again. Or you'll get this thing where, you'll get a few slides in and the customer will say, oh, I get it. You're just like Salesforce. And you're like, oh God, no, we're nothing like Salesforce. So they think you're something you're not. Or the absolute worst one is you'll get a few slides in and the customer will be making this face, right? Like, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, man, I get it. I get what you are. I just don't get why anyone would pay for that. Like I could just do that with the spreadsheet, man. Why are we even talking? That sucks. And so they get you, but they don't get the value. And so we're looking for that. Like, live sales call, particularly if we're doing this over video, you can see a lot where the customer is confused versus, great positioning is more like this. The customer's on and they're like, oh yeah, 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 man, we really have, oh yeah, we've got that. Oh yeah, for sure. Oh, we got that too. So show me how this works. Okay. And they're asking 1,000 questions because they're super engaged, and they're asking about pricing because they want to know whether or not they can afford it because they're super engaged and they're pretty interested. So the difference between a good sales pitch and a bad sales pitch is pretty stark generally.
Mm-hmm. So yes, we're like judging by number of head nods. That's the metric.
You're looking for this face where, like what you don't want is this face where they're like, what is it?
Yeah. And then tick the box. This was a yes or this was a no. It's pretty easy to distinguish. And so, you've gotten to a place where, you feel like you've got strong positioning. It is resonating in the sales pitch. It is working in the content, the messaging. You're starting to. How do you know when you're done? Is there an end point to positioning?
I wish we could just be done. That would be great.
Yeah. When's it over?
But we're not, which sucks. Like, so the reason we don't get to, so what happens is usually, we'll do this group exercise. We'll figure out the positioning. We'll build a sales pitch. We'll go test it. Once we've tested it and we're feeling like that's, been validated, we're now going to train the salespeople on this pitch. We're now going to marketing. We're going to forklift the messaging, make sure the messaging sounds all good. And then we're going to, have campaigns aimed at the right target customers and all that stuff. Away we go. Now, the problem is that everything changes all the time. So, your product doesn't stay the same. So you have a new release, so you have new capabilities. Some of those are really differentiated. That might impact your differentiated value. So, there's changes coming from you. There's also changes happening in the market. So, you have, your competitors are putting out new releases and they're changing things, and that, so maybe they're catching up to you on things that used to be differentiated and now they're not anymore because these folks have caught up. Sometimes you have really big macro changes in the market, like, a big competitor enters the market, or there's some M&A activity and somebody buys somebody, and all of a sudden someone who is a no big deal competitor is all up in your face. And then you've got external forces like, like we're seeing a little bit of it right now. The economy's not so great. You have sometimes what you'll have is a value proposition that's really around helping customers grow. And then the economy gets kind of flat, and all of a sudden customers aren't really prioritizing growth. They're actually prioritizing reduction in spend or savings. Sure. And so that might require an adjustment on your positioning because your value just isn't hitting the way it is. Your value isn't valuable to those customers anymore. Right. And so what I usually recommend is, in the companies I worked in that were B2B, we typically had a standing meeting every 6 months. So every 6 months, we would get this cross-functional team together, and we'd be running through the positioning and saying, okay, competitive alternatives, any new competitors popping up, anybody falling out? Like, is the competitive list the same? And then we look at differentiated capabilities. Are they still the same, or have competitors caught up, or maybe we've added some things? So we'll go down this capabilities. And then, if anything is significantly changed there, is it enough that it actually changes our value themes? In which case, we better go back and relook at the positioning again, because it probably needs an adjustment. If we go through that and nothing's changed, and we go, good, great, everything's fine, see you in 6 months. And then we go away, we come back in 6 months. So where I was, when I was a VP marketing, we used to do that every 6 months. The only time that we wouldn't be doing it every 6 months is if some big deal thing happened. So like once I worked at a company and we had this gorgeous positioning, but we had a strategic partnership with a company, and our positioning kind of relied on that. And so we had this positioning, it worked really well for 6 months, but then that company got acquired. And so we were like, oh shit. So we had to go back and look at it and adjust. And then we said, well, and then that worked really great for about 8 months. And then the acquiring company themselves got acquired by an even bigger company. And not only that, the bigger company that acquired them sort of threatened to shut down the product that we were aligned with. And then we were like, oh no, throw it all out, come back. And we had to have the emergency positioning meeting around that one. Like, what are we going to do about this thing? And so we changed the positioning a lot because there was like big stuff happening in the market. I've had other ones like, they just shut it down, but the very first product I ever positioned, and I've been doing this a long time, so that's like 25 years ago or so, we positioned this product as an embeddable database for mobile devices, and it was super successful. We ended up getting acquired by a big company, and then that company later got acquired by SAP. And so recently I went and looked that product up just to see, and the positioning was almost the same. Like, it's remarkably unchanged. Like they talked more about Internet of Things than they did about just mobile devices, but otherwise the positioning it hadn't changed all that much. Hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue later. So I don't know. So sometimes the positioning sticks and it works for a really long time. Sometimes it's good for 6 months, and then you got to throw it out and kind of do something again. And right. You really don't know what's happening until you see. None of us can predict the future, unfortunately.
Yeah. For sure. But it's a good tip, right? To like revisit it every 6 months. So you could revisit it every 6 months for 20 years and decide it doesn't need to be changed, but you got to keep on top of it. And
well, that's it. If you don't revisit it, then the risk is things start to slip and you don't notice until it's a problem. And then it's like an emergency. And then it's like, oh no. And now we're slow to react, and it takes a while for the new positioning to hit, and we've wasted 6 months because we weren't on top of it.
I think we saw that a lot with the pandemic, where I mean, literally every company should have been repositioning at that stage.
A lot of companies needed to reposition.
Yeah,
and never been so busy. Never been so busy in my life. Like, there was just a lot of repositioning work, and now what we're getting is, in certain industries, things are opening back up again. And so we're doing a lot of positioning around that. But unfortunately, we're also seeing a lot of positioning because the economy's crappy, and some parts of, some buyers have really slowed down because the economy stuff. Before that, there was like supply chain things, and that was really impacting certain businesses. And so, there's a lot of things that can happen. They're completely outside of the business's control and completely impossible to predict, that we just need to roll with it.
For sure. I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show today. I learned so much, and I read your content. I've read your book twice, and I learned so much today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know I'm going to take a lot away from this conversation as next steps. I hope everybody listening will as well. Thanks everyone who did listen in. We will be back with another episode soon. April mentioned jobs to be done. That's what we're talking about next time with Stephen Wunker. Join us then.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.